on a much different kind of a note, and in many ways a much lighter kind of a note, we're going to take a look today at the years following World War II for average Americans, where we see this kind of, a lot of truth to it, the kind of the cliched atmosphere of the 1950s, a time of putting, for a lot of Americans, certainly not for all. Of course, we know there's always going to be exceptions, but a incredibly prosperous era. An era of unprecedented economic prosperity. Once again, just like how the whole communist hysteria and frenzy kind of mimics the 1920s, right after World War I. In some ways, the 1950s, the decade immediately following World War II, very much mimics the 1920s also in this prosperity, economic expansion, and consumerism, all those kind of things. We're going to see some very similar things happening, but on an even grander scale, because World War II, completely transformed American life. It completely transformed the American economy. And it leads to this period of unprecedented and long, lengthy economic prosperity that Americans were eager and ready to indulge in. After Depression and war, people were ready to buy and spend and enjoy themselves and enjoy that prosperity. Now, it comes with anxiety as well. That's the name of the section, because they are living in this period of heightened fear of war and the threat of nuclear war. And so bomb shelters and nuclear, bomb drills and all that kind of stuff in school were a part of people's lives as well. And the fear of communists and spies and all of that was very much a part of it. But we see overall a lot of prosperity, contentment, the growth of the middle class, incomes are increasing, and so forth as a result, and in the decades following World War II. So there were great concerns once the war ended, that the Depression was going to return, because it was the war that had, in large part, brought the United States out of that Depression completely, closed that gap between production and consumption, gotten the economy back to full employment. And so people worried that once the war was over and there was no need for all the planes and the weapons and all that kind of stuff, that you would see unemployment rise again and we would go back to the Depression. And with these millions of American GIs coming back, that would mean too many people looking for jobs and there were jobs available. And there was a little bit of a brief recession right as the war ended. But then we see this economic boom, this huge economic expansion, the longest economic expansion that we see in the United States' history, continuing until sometime in the 1970s with immense prosperity. What we call the GDP, stands for Gross Domestic Product. It's kind of one of the big indicators of economic health. It more than doubles in the 1950s. Incomes more than doubled in the 1950s. The middle class grows tremendously throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. So the largest and longest period of economic growth the United States has ever seen, and that impacted so many Americans' lives and the way that they lived. So people were worried that there would be high unemployment with the end of wartime production, but the thing is, while wartime production decreased to an extent, there was still a lot of government support of the economy, because the government was still spending a lot of money on defense because of the Cold War, militarism, and those things that we talked about the other day. So all of that's going to continue. We're going to see later, the government's going to be spending money on highways and infrastructure. All of that keeps the economy moving and growing. There's new technology available that part of it was a result of the war, some of it not, but that's keeping things moving. There's also not a whole lot of foreign competition because Europe at that moment was still, devastated from the war, and they were not up to their levels of manufacturing and production that they had been, so there's little competition there. But another thing is, just demand. There was demand for stuff. There was demand for consumer products. All those things that they hadn't been producing during the war, that they couldn't produce during the war, now they can, and people are ready to buy like crazy. So a massive economic expansion that then, when, there's more demand for products, that's more businesses that can open, that's more jobs, that's higher their wages, it all just fuels itself. It all becomes a cycle. Now, another thing that assists in that transition and that assists with that economic expansion, among other things, is the GI Bill of Rights, or sometimes we just call this the GI Bill. So you've probably heard of the GI Bill before. Once again, there was great concern about when all these millions of American GIs came home, what would, would they be given any kind of assistance? And we're going to have too many people trying to enter the job market. And how can we make sure that GIs are taken care of and that the economy does well and that we don't have high unemployment and all of that? So the GI Bill of Rights, among other things, this provided money for college for returning war veterans so that they could go to college. And all this is still around. This is how people in the military can get college education paid for and such. That's with the GI Bill. So that way, you would have a lot of American GIs not returning to the workforce, but being able to go to college. So one that cuts down on quite so many going into the workforce. But it's also increasing those people's opportunities, giving more people an opportunity to go to college and to get a higher education. And that's going to lead to far more opportunities for those people, a much more educated workforce. And as well as college education, the GI Bill also provided loans for at home, loans for a business, other things that returning GIs could use to, improve their life, whether that was buying a new home for their family, starting a new business, even medical expenses paid for by the GI Bill. So those returning war veterans and their families are ready to utilize and take advantage of that consumer prosperity and are ready to buy. So what we see in the 1950s, kind of similar to what we saw in the 1920s, was a massive consumer culture. We talked about that with the 1920s, an economy that was based and that relied on heavy amounts of consumer spending. Same thing in the 1950s. Recall that people have lived through now a decade of depression and then a decade of war where they had to save and they had to get by with what they had and ration their food and ration all these different things. So once all that's over, people are ready to buy. There is just great pent-up consumer demand for all kinds of nice things, for appliances, for homes. There's a huge increase in home buying in the 1940s. And home ownership is increasing, partially because of government loans and programs to make financing for homes more available, and also things that were making homes more available just on their own. And then with homes, what kind of thing people buy new houses? What are the kind of things they want to buy to go with that nice new house? Like what? Their stove and their electric, range and their dishwasher. What now? Furniture for the home. All the pretty little things to put in the home. Lawn mowers to keep your lawn nice and neat. Just any kind of, clothing, shoes, makeup, whatever. Just all kind of consumer products to go along with that. And that certainly becomes this kind of image of the ideal life, the good life in the 1950s, your house with your car and all the stuff and all the nice things. And people ready to buy. Advertising in the 1950s, just like what you see in the 1920s. Massive advertising campaigns in magazines. And one thing we have new in the 1950s is television. Remember in the 20s, it was the radio that suddenly became the new norm, that suddenly became the big craze. Television does that for the 1950s and there onward. Television had been around. It wasn't completely new, but just like the radio wasn't new to the 20s, but the 20s is when it became widely available. Same thing here, is that for the first time televisions became widely available, affordable enough for the average person to have. So by the mid to end of the 1950s, you've got pretty much a television in every home. And that is the people gathering around the TV to watch their favorite sitcoms, I Love Lucy and Father Knows Best and all of that, children's shows, news, all sorts of things, musical programs, showing movies some nights a week. So that becomes part of the 1950s culture as well, and enhancing, advertising and consumerism. Commercials for all these nice things and financing plans, credit, same kind of stuff we saw again in the 1920s. So a new TV culture and people sitting around the television, which means that people don't listen to the radio as much. It eventually displaces the radio, most people having a TV instead of a radio. The movie industry doesn't go anywhere, but you see a little bit of a decline in that because people can watch things at home. Another aspect of the 1950s at home is a massive increase in the birth rate, the baby boom. Because of the Depression and then the war, people had put off having children, either because they couldn't afford them or they were busy fighting a war. But when GIs come home and a lot of them are getting married, and some of them already were, babies just start being born in a huge rate, massive increase in the birth rate. So young married couples that had delayed having children, this became part of that 1950s image, was, the perfect family with 2.5, 2.25 children or something weird like that is like the average. This is kind of strange. So something like between, and this baby boom goes on not just in the 50s, so it starts about 1946 when the war's over, until about the mid-1970s. Somewhere in that time, something like, I got a number written down somewhere, but millions of babies are born. The birth rate had been declining for decades, and then it continues to go up. It reaches its peak probably sometime in the mid-1950s. And we're still seeing the effects of that, actually, in this massive generation. In the 70s, it was when all these kids were going to elementary school, and all of a sudden more elementary schools had to be built. There was a big demand for teachers and all that. Now this is the generation that is getting older and retiring, and so there are big concerns about strain on Medicare and strain on Social Security and all of that. You know this phrase because what's the phrase now that people use when an old person says something? Oh, baby boomer. That's what they're talking about. If you didn't know, baby boomers. That's probably more your parents' generation. No, your grandparents, my parents, or your grandparents' generation. But that's my parents' age. But in case you didn't know where that came from, that's what they're talking about, because that is the retired over the age of 65 generation these days. And when we think of the ideal 1950s family and the ideal 1950s picture, another big phenomenon is people are moving away from the cities, tired of the urban life, and moving to the suburbs, moving to these little communities outside of cities where they can enjoy their home and their lawn with affordable housing and freedom and abundance and all of that. So suburbs with these tiny, cute little houses, cookie cutter houses oftentimes, where it's probably the same floor plan, and the nice, neat little lawns and a tree planted every couple of feet. More and more Americans moving to those suburbs as opposed to living in urban cities. And this was kind of sort of a new fad idea, and developed by some developers that kind of modeled this whole kind of planned community with these model homes, and they're all exactly the same. And then people start modeling and sort of copying that throughout the country. But instead of living in the cities, people moving in the suburbs where they can easily commute to cities. And because of that, there's more people buying cars. We've talked about cars before, and most people had them. But now a car culture is exploding even more, with people moving to the suburbs and needing cars to drive into the city to do their shopping, to work, and all of that. Cars become the ultimate status symbol, like a lot of things in the 1950s. And then that gives rise to other kind of car-related industries, drive-ins, drive-in movie theaters, drive-in restaurants, fast food, convenience stores, more highways, more roads, all of that contributing to this suburban car culture. Now, not everyone moving to the suburbs, for sure, but there are other ways in which groups of Americans are moving and migrating to different parts of the country. We mentioned that in the 1920s, we saw this great migration of African Americans moving out of the South. We see that actually happening again in the 1950s. So there's kind of a new great migration, as a lot of rural Southern African Americans are continuing to move out of the South and to the North and to the Midwest. So a similar phenomenon than we saw before, but it's continuing to happen, seeking better jobs, seeking better opportunities, seeking better housing. But that is also happening, you realize, simultaneously with a lot of mostly white families moving to the suburbs. White flight, we call that. So oftentimes while they are moving to the cities for better opportunities, that doesn't mean they always get those opportunities. Because there will still, of course, be massive discrimination in jobs, in housing even, and with a lot of more affluent white families moving out of those urban areas, they're becoming more poverty stricken, they're not as invested in, and so you kind of have this, vicious cycle kind of continuing. A little bit about 1950s culture as far as expectations, attitudes, what people expected as far as how one should live and the kind of values that they thought were important. The 1950s is definitely not a time to be an individual, not a time to go against the grain, not a time to go against the norm, not a time to be different. The 1950s glorifies a conformist culture. What does that mean to conform? Do what everybody else is doing. There is definitely a emphasis on uniformity. Things like the suburbs demonstrate that. Nice, neat little houses that all kind of look the same. Everybody's got a car or two in the garage. Everybody keeps their lawn nice and neat. Rules about what you can have out in the yard, stuff like that. But everything from the suburbs to the way people dress, to what they do with their lives is all part of that conformist. Individuality was not celebrated. It was more of an emphasis on be clean cut, kind of meet this certain image. The expectation that you'll marry and have children, have a family, have a job, have the car, have all the stuff. Keeping up with the Joneses is the phrase. You want to do like the neighbors and look like everybody else. So there's definitely not a sense of kind of going against the grain. Some of that conformist culture is aided and abetted by the move to the suburbs. It is also aided and partially because of changes in the way people work, changes in the kind of employment that a lot of Americans have, and the kind of expectation that people experienced in their jobs. The workforce is changing in that more and more people are working in what we would call white-collar jobs, increase in white-collar jobs. We hear that phrase a lot about the difference between white-collar and blue-collar labor or white-collar and blue-collar jobs. Let's talk about that for a second just so we know what it is. So what is the difference between white-collar and blue-collar? What does that mean?
A white-collar job is more of a non-fixed job where you all work in like cubicles and stuff like that. And a blue-collar job is more like someone who's a mechanic or someone who builds things and stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely. So white-collar jobs, think more of the office worker, of something that oftentimes requires perhaps more education, maybe more education and less training. Whereas blue-collar jobs are more sometimes manual labor kind of thing, an electrician or mechanic or something like that. Blue-collar jobs in this period, though, are becoming better paid. So those are becoming people that are moving into the middle class as the middle class is growing. But it's more corporate kind of stuff, because this is the beginning of like big conglomerates, major corporations, big companies like AT&T and General Motors and General Electric and Westinghouse. And most Americans that worked in white-collar jobs worked in those big corporations. But office jobs, the kind of job titles, I sort of think of it almost as like, someone says they're a mechanic or someone says they're an electrician. you know what they do. Oftentimes, a lot of white collar jobs, somebody tells you their job title, and you go, "What is that?" You know, something analyst. I don't know. I'm making fun of it, but there you are. So more people that are working in offices, putting on the suit and tie to go to work, as you can see here, conforming. You know, everybody looks the same. Having a little desk, a little row of cubicles, everything is the same. Part of that is part of that conformist culture as well. White collar workers, white collar jobs outnumbering blue collar jobs for the first time. And big businesses, big companies. You know, we've seen in the past this, movement trying to bring down big companies, antitrust stuff. That was relaxed during the 1950s because you have a lot of, pairing of the government with these companies, giving them contracts, defense contracts, and all of that. So those are actually growing. Gender roles of the 1950s. What do you think those were like? Yeah.
Mom stays at home and takes care of all the new baby boom kids, and dad goes to work.
Yep, dad goes to work, her husband goes to work in his nice little office job. Women staying home, and very much, we know that's not a new concept, but in the 1950s, very much glorifying the role of women in the home, being a homemaker, creating a comfortable home, and the baby boom is a part of that. Advertising is a part of that, really emphasizing, motherhood and glorifying that as a woman's job. Most women, of course, that had gone to work, that had gone into the factories and such during World War II, don't stay there a lot. Most of them by their own choice, but most of them are going to return to the home, and then many of them relish those roles, and it's all, played up in advertisements and stuff like that. It's really, it's kind of funny, and it's kind of sad and kind of infuriating. You look at some of the 1950s ads that just say just really crazy and just really, really sexist stuff by today's standards about women and men and all that, like you see here. So men expected to be the breadwinner, go to school, support your family, all of that. But youth even of the 1950s, kind of seen in a little bit of a different light. Youth of the 1950s, young people, teenagers, more of them, there's kind of a less responsibility. More fun. More of an emphasis on for young children to play. More of them are in school. But for teenagers, people your age, again, just less responsibility. More time for parties. More time for going to football games and basketball games and enjoying sports. And advertisers seeing teenagers as a group they got to market to, music and movies and clothes and all kind of things that they market specifically to teenagers. So that becoming a true demographic that was marketable and all of that. So, young people, more, like I said, in school, and just kind of, for many of them, enjoying a little bit more of a relaxed lifestyle, particularly for those, white middle class, suburban young people. Religion of the 1950s. Americans are far more religious in the 1950s. Increases in church membership, huge increases in church attendance. That's part of conforming. That would kind of just became part of the image and part of what you conformed to in the 50s. Doing, what society expected you to do. It also is related to the Cold War and communism. Communism is labeled as a godless philosophy and a godless system, and the Soviets are godless people. So we have to, fight that with religious faith. And so we see this emphasis on religion, not just in people going to church, but even things like that. It's in the 50s when phrases like "In God We Trust" was added to money. That's when the line "One Nation Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. All that added then because of that, not just emphasis on religion, but emphasis on religion's role in fighting communism, or the need for that to fight communism. Now, of course, there are plenty of challenges to conformity. There are plenty of people that this didn't apply to. and not just, people that didn't conform and that went against the grain and acted differently or dressed differently or all things like that. There are certain aspects of 1950s prosperity that, of course, didn't apply to everybody. There were still, of course, people in poverty. The suburbs tended to be, if not de facto racially segregated, some outright racially segregated. We talked about, the GI Bill providing college education to returning veterans, but a lot of colleges, most of them, still racially segregated. So a lot of people could not or were not able or were not included in that post-war prosperity. There were plenty of women who did work, so it's not like all women stayed home. It's not like all women got married. Of course, there's always exceptions to that. It's not near as many, but there were plenty of women in the workforce, mostly, though, in clerical jobs. You don't see too many, a huge percentage of women in, higher paid professional jobs. So oftentimes it's going to be clerical work, secretaries, retail, stuff like that. And some youth are, of course, rebelling against the norm, seeking their own style. And just like jazz became sort of the rebellious music, the rebellious culture of the 1950s, what serves that same purpose or plays that same role in the 50s? Rock and roll, right? So that's definitely part of that 1950s culture, youth culture, but very much a challenge to conformity. Beginnings of rock and roll music, which combined several different styles of music, African American styles of music, blues, and it was quite a shocking, phenomenon to your more conservative Americans of the 1950s, shocked at hearing young people listen to this music, and particularly for young white people buying and listening to music by African American artists. And just like people, complained that jazz was, everybody was going to hell for listening to jazz music, you can imagine what it was like in the 50s. And just a complete hysteria over young people dancing and listening to this music and all the ideas that it was spreading, and that people were just, going to hell in a handbasket because of it. Afraid that it was vulgar and overly sexual and all this sort of thing. They wouldn't on television show Elvis from the waist down, complaining it was too vulgar and couldn't let people see that. It's just real, very pretentious. But rock and roll was certainly, was not a fad that went away, and also something that was quite ethnically diverse and really brought, musicians and artists and styles from a lot of different racial backgrounds into the mainstream. So it's a very culturally significant thing, as well as just, a cultural phenomenon. Okay, so of course that's not an image that's true for all, but it definitely gives us kind of the nostalgic, sort of sometimes feel-good image of the 50s. So now